I think this is a good decision by the FDA. It's based on recently accumulated data around the antibody or immune response in immunocompromised people who have a weakened immune system, as you mentioned, cancer patients, transplant patients, et cetera. So I think it's a good decision. It tells us a lot about where the science and data are heading. And I do believe that this presages a decision about a broader application of booster immunizations. You know, it's not that uncommon, right?
Well, millions of Americans turn to the FDA for assurances that the medications and products they use are safe. Created in the early 20th century, the agency was designed to protect the U.S. consumer from unsafe, ineffective medications, equipment, and contaminated food. The agency has had some real success stories, from blocking a morning sickness drug in the 60s that caused birth defects to regulating the manufacturing of foods and purity of over-the-counter medications. The FDA has many times ensured that high-quality, trustworthy products enter American homes. But an agency that was once fully taxpayer-funded and thus worked only for the American people has now shifted to being largely funded by the very industries it regulates. 45% of the FDA's overall budget now comes from the companies it's reviewing, and 65% of the FDA's budget specifically for human drug regulation comes directly from Big Pharma itself. Now, how can an agency regulate an industry it's being funded by? That's a pretty basic and fair question. This new way to fund the FDA began in the 90s, and through the years, the FDA's reliance on company money has increased. It all started in the 80s when the HIV crisis was creating fear amongst the masses. People were upset that experimental treatments were taking a while to be approved by the FDA. Typical approval for a drug in that time was in the range of 3 to 8 years. And in response to intense pressure, Congress in the early 90s shifted how the FDA was funded in order to encourage speeding up the process. So instead of the agency being fully taxpayer funded, the new setup would have the drug companies themselves footing part of the bill. Now, this would theoretically allow the FDA to expand and hire more people to speed up the regulatory process. And in exchange for pharma money, the FDA would have to set goal dates for drug reviews that were satisfactory to the drug companies. So let's look at the safety record of the drugs since this change in funding. Now, the FDA doesn't always get it right. Prior to this shift in funding, the FDA withdrew or issued black box warning labels on about 21% of the previously approved drugs. That's not really a great record, but it gets worse after the change in funding. The FDA now withdraws or retroactively slaps warning labels on over 26% of previously approved drugs. This means that over a quarter of all FDA-approved drugs later, sometimes years later, end up either being taken off the market because they find out, oops, they're actually not so safe, or they discover serious side effects that require a large black box warning to be placed on the packaging. And a quarter is being generous. Researchers at the Yale School of Medicine found that nearly a third of approved drugs between 2001 and 2010 ended up having major safety issues years after the medications were made widely available. Now, this funding shift that lets companies pay the FDA a fee in exchange for speedy reviews isn't the only conflict of interest. The revolving door between the agency and cushy pharma jobs is another area of concern. Researchers found 27% of regulators left the FDA to work in high-paying pharma jobs. This leads us to wonder if the regulators who are looking out for their own careers are going easy on pharma in order to stay in their good graces for later job opportunities. And how they even make contacts to get those jobs is also eyebrow-raising. Questions have been raised regarding the mingling of regulators and company representatives at conferences and lunches held in high-end fancy hotels such as the Four Seasons. One such concerning annual conference is put on by the organization Impact. The stated goal of the organization is to improve the design of clinical trials. Drug manufacturers pay tens of thousands of dollars to send reps to mingle with FDA officials and NIH researchers at their annual conference. And it seems to have paid off. One clinical trial initiative that sprung from these conferences is called Enriched Enrollment, which allows drug companies to weed out subjects who are non-responsive or who have adverse reactions to the drugs from the clinical trials. This speeds up the approval process and ensures the drug will prove more effective in the data. And speaking of the data, because pharmaceutical companies are paying for the clinical trials, there are many questions regarding the impartiality of the results. Not to mention, the barometer is usually a placebo, not existing effective drugs. So a company only has to prove that their new, expensive, not eligible to be generic treatment is better than nothing. And there's the payments from the pharmaceutical companies to the FDA's physician advisors. Before drugs and treatments are approved, a panel of advisors meet to hear the science, ask questions, and vote whether or not to recommend an approval. The advisors must disclose any possible conflicts of interest. Obviously, this is meant to keep the regulators on the side of the people. But here's the problem. It's well known and widespread that panel members will receive future payments and gifts from the companies they are reviewing or from their major competitors. In fact, a study done by Science found that the 107 physician advisors they looked into, 40 of them had received post hoc earnings or research support to the tune of at least $10,000, 26 of which received more than $100,000, and 6 who received more than $1 million. The report concludes, quote, of the more than $24 million in personal payments or research support from the industry to the 16 top earning advisors who received more than $300,000 each, 93% came from the makers of drugs those advisors previously reviewed or from competitors, unquote. So yeah, maybe these advisors didn't have conflicts of interest before their vote, but knowing the drug companies might make it rain after their vote sure can be persuasive. So in recap, we have a regulatory body that's funded by the very companies they are supposed to be regulating, with about a third of the regulators and advisors either moving on to cushy big pharma careers or receiving lucrative payouts after approving the drugs or halting the drugs of competitors based on data from expensive clinical trials funded by the pharmaceutical companies that test their treatments against literally nothing. So it's no wonder that a third of all approved treatments are later found to have harmful, unknown side effects. This is once again a government body like Congress that is supposed to be beneficial to the American people that has instead been corrupted by big money. And the solution towards taking steps to correcting it begins with eliminating those avenues that allow these multi-billionaires the ability to have so much influence. So Ryan, I'm going to ask you, getting money out of politics is obviously something that many of us continue to talk about. Do you see a way for us to kind of start getting that process done? It's not just Congress, it's also these regulatory bodies.
Think about the stigma that a detective in the 1950s who's investigating the mob would have faced if they then went and started working for the mob.
Right.
Nobody would do that, and you have to bring that culture to government. It should not be okay to continue going through this revolving door.
So a bit of a counterpoint, though I found myself agreeing with much of what Kim said. My fear is this, having worked in the federal government during the COVID pandemic, dealing directly with the FDA and the CDC, I can tell you I've never worked, and I worked at the Department of Defense, I've never worked with a government bureaucracy more inefficient and more unaware that there was a fire under them and they still couldn't get things done than the FDA during COVID. And granted, that is kind of the Super Bowl in the worst way of what the FDA is ever going to deal with. Of course, we need credible, independent regulatory bodies to look at our medicines and our treatments. But one story I remember being told by Dr. Redfield, the former director of the CDC, who at the time, would have been decades ago during the AIDS and HIV crisis, was a military doctor. And there were therapeutics that had not gone through full approval by the FDA, authorized under emergency use, that he could not get approval within the FDA for nearly 20 years. And he told me that he could point to the number of lives that could have been saved of people who fell victim to AIDS had that been approved sooner.
Mike, welcome to the show. We appreciate you being on tonight.
Thanks for the invitation, Joe.
Okay, let's talk about the rat of the week. Why is Bayer Corporation the rat of the week?
Internal documents show that after this company positively, absolutely knew that they had a medication that was infected with the AIDS virus, they took the product off the market in the U.S. and then they dumped it in France, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The medicine's called Factor 8. It was an an injection medicine that was used for hemophiliacs, mostly children. Children had been born with an incurable disease.
Hold on, Mike. So, hold on. So you're telling me that Bayer knew that this drug was infected with the AIDS virus. They yanked it from the market in America, and then they dumped it in markets overseas?
They had to figure out a way, Joe, to make a profit on a product that they could not sell in America. So they made a huge profit. They dropped the product in Japan, Spain, and France. By the way, Joe, government officials in France that allowed that to happen actually had to go to prison for it. In America, not one corporate executive for this company has been indicted or even criminally investigated by our Justice Department.
Why not? You're telling me that these people that dumped this AIDS-tainted blood in foreign countries, who killed children, have not been taken to task in the United States?
It's worse than that. The U.S. government allowed it to happen. The FDA allowed this to happen.
It's been a hellish 3.5 years. I haven't been able to work in over 3 years.
I call it, my head exploded. It just exploded.
I didn't know if I was going to make it.
They went from active professional people to barely being able to live on their own.
Now my life is just a living hell.
Their common link, terrible reactions to prescription drugs.
I was simply given a legal pill called Levaquin, and now it's ruined my life.
Former pharmaceutical sales rep John Fratty took the drug Levaquin for an infection. He went from charging the basketball court to barely being able to walk.
I've now been diagnosed with suffering from Levaquin-induced brain damage, damage to my nerves, and damage to my tendons.
Less than a year ago, the FDA mandated the makers of the drug put a black box warning on the prescription for tendinitis and tendon rupture. It was too late for John.
We live here in America, and we should be afforded the right to know that a drug can cause irreversible damage.
Americans are 10 times more likely to be hospitalized from an adverse drug reaction than from a car crash. Drug reactions are the 4th leading cause of death in the country.
The FDA and the industry are doing a terrible job assuring the public that what they are getting after a doctor writes a prescription for them is really adequately safe.
The FDA refused to talk to us for this story. Dr. Sidney Wolf sits on an FDA committee that measures the safety and risks of prescription drugs.
I think tightening up the drug review process, which doesn't necessarily mean making it longer, it just means making it more thorough and changing the culture in the FDA so people aren't so much in awe of the drug industry and instead are in awe of the public health.
Dr. Wolf says user fees are a huge problem with the drug approval process. That's money drug companies pay the FDA to get their products reviewed and put on the market. In 2009, proposed user fees will make up more than $600 million of the FDA's budget, a 14% increase from last year. It will pay for more than half of all drug reviews.
We now find people at the FDA who refer to the drug industry as their customers.
President of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA, Steve Grossman, says some level of funding from the drug companies is necessary because the agency can't survive on the current federal budget.
The FDA needs about a $100 million increase just to about break even.
And I think we always had the expectation that this might be the case.
And that was the former commissioner of the FDA, Dr. Stephen Hahn, on Mornings with Maria with me last week on Fox Business, praising the FDA's decision to authorize COVID boosters for people with weakened immune systems.